When you think about World War I, what comes to mind? Probably trenches, right? Barbed wire, mud. But what if I told you there was another war happening at the exact same time? A war fought not with guns, but with gold reserves, bond markets, and balance sheets. This was the financial war. And it didn't just help decide who won, it totally rewired the entire global economy. And believe it or not, the way it played out still affects your wallet today.
So let's just sit with that for a second. Money is a weapon. The First World War proved this wasn't just some clever phrase. It was brutally, devastatingly true. The war showed the world that money, when weaponized by a government, could be just as destructive as an artillery shell. It could literally wipe out empires and vaporize the life savings of millions of ordinary people.
Now, I know what you're thinking. 1914. That's ancient history. What does that have to do with me? Well, here's the crazy part. The financial playbook that was written in the chaos of that war, things like printing money out of thin air, convincing people that going into debt is patriotic, borrowing from the future to pay for today, that's the exact same playbook governments pull out in almost every modern financial crisis. The echoes of 1914, they're not faint. They're screaming at us.
All right, so let's really get into it. What does it mean to fight a war with money? Well, think about it like this. While soldiers were paying the ultimate price in the mud and the trenches, a very different kind of battle was happening in quiet boardrooms. Bankers and government ministers were making calculations. Calculations that would end up shaping the entire 20th century and beyond.
And here's the thing you have to understand. In 1914, Europe was a total powder keg, just waiting to explode with all its rivalries and alliances. But fighting a modern industrial war, that was insanely expensive. So when the leaders chose to go to war, they were making another choice at the same time, whether they admitted it or not. They were choosing debt. Every single soldier marching to the front was a symbol of their nation marching into a future of just unimaginable economic pain. From the very first shot, this was a war that would be paid for with debt.
To really grasp how radical this all was, you have to understand the world before the war. The global financial system wasn't the Wild West. It ran on a set of very strict rules. Rules that were all about creating stability and trust. And at the very core of this whole system was one single, incredibly powerful idea.
And that idea was the gold standard. Think of it like an anchor for the whole economy. It basically meant that paper money wasn't just paper, it was a promise. A promise that you could, in theory, trade it in for a fixed amount of actual physical gold. This meant governments couldn't just fire up the printing presses whenever they wanted. Their spending was limited by how much gold they had in the vault. And that's great for stability, but it's a huge problem if you're trying to fund the biggest war in human history.
And right there, that's why the whole system was totally doomed. The war was just burning through money at a speed that nobody could have possibly imagined. I mean, get this. Britain was spending £2.5 million every single day. Germany, over 10 million marks a day. The math was just brutal. There was no way the gold reserves could keep up. Something had to break.
And so, this is it. This is the moment everything changes. Faced with a simple choice, go bankrupt and lose the war, or something else, the great powers made a decision. A decision that would change the very definition of money forever.
They just broke the rules. One by one, quietly, the nations of Europe abandoned the gold standard. They cut the cord. They detached their money from physical gold. And in doing so, they basically admitted that their currency was now backed by, well, nothing more than a promise. A promise and your faith in the government. This one single act unshackled money from reality and turned it into a pure instrument of power, backed by printing presses and a whole lot of propaganda.
Okay, so if money is just a promise now, how do you get people to buy into it? How do you fund this gigantic war? Well, the major powers each took a very different strategic path, and their choices would decide their fate. And the difference between Germany and Britain is really fascinating. It's like a tale of two completely different strategies. Germany, you see, was being strangled by the British naval blockade. They were cut off, so they had to turn inward. They launched these huge war bond campaigns, plastering the country with propaganda that basically said, giving us your life savings is your patriotic duty. It was a financial pyramid scheme built entirely on the hope of winning the war. Britain, on the other hand, could look outward. They had access to the entire world's financial system, and they turned to one place in particular, Wall Street. Firms like J.P. Morgan basically bankrolled the Allied war effort. And in the process, they transformed the United States from a country that owed money to the world into the world's biggest lender. And then there was Russia. And Russia's story?
It was just an absolute train wreck. Their economy was huge but not very developed. Their banks were shaky. The whole system just wasn't ready for this kind of pressure. They borrowed a ton of money from Britain and France, but as they kept losing on the battlefield, they just printed more and more rubles to cover the costs. Inflation went through the roof. Pretty soon, nobody trusted the currency at all. And all that economic chaos, it poured gasoline on the fire of the 1917 revolution.
So, November 1918, the guns finally go silent. But the war isn't really over. The fighting just moved from the trenches to the world's balance sheets. The old, stable financial order was completely shattered, and in its place was something new and much, much more fragile.
And if you want to know the single biggest change that came out of this financial war, it's this: a massive, seismic shift in global power. Before the war, the United States was the debtor nation. It owed money to other countries. After the war, it was the world's largest creditor, period. Wall Street was now the center of the financial universe, not London. You could say the American century truly began right there.
People at the time called it a financial merry-go-round, and honestly, that's the perfect description. The whole post-war system was built on this incredibly fragile and kind of crazy loop. Check this out. American banks would lend money to Germany. Germany would then use that money to pay war reparations to Britain and France. And then what did Britain and France do with the money? They sent it right back to America to pay off their own war debts. See, it's just one big circle of money, a merry-go-round that looked like it was moving, but it was really just built on a foundation of recycled debt.
And a system like that, well, it's not going to last. What followed was a decade of one financial disaster after another. First, Germany tries to print its way out of debt, leading to that insane hyperinflation where people were taking wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Then, Britain, trying to look strong, goes back on the gold standard at the old pre-war price, a totally disastrous move that just crushed their economy. The whole house of cards was just wobbling, waiting for one big gust of wind. And that gust came in 1929 with the Great Depression.
Okay, so let's bring this all back to today. Why should we care about all this century-old financial history? Here's why. Because the playbook that was written out of pure desperation during World War I, it never went away. In fact, it became the standard operating procedure for how modern governments deal with crises.
Just think about what's in this playbook. Step 1. Cut money loose from reality, from gold. Step 2. Fire up the printing presses to pay your bills. Step 3. Sell massive amounts of debt to your own citizens, but call it patriotism. Step 4. Borrow on a global scale like there's no tomorrow. And Step 5. Try to patch it all up later with a lot of promises and good PR. This was the moment governments realized they could fund literally anything, as long as they could print, borrow, and convince the public to go along with it.
Does any of that sound familiar? It should. Every time you hear a politician or a central banker say that inflation is just transitory or that we don't need to worry about the national debt, you are hearing the ghosts of 1914. This idea of borrowing from the future to solve the problems of today, that is the central financial lesson the world learned from World War I, and we've never unlearned it.
So what are the big, brutal takeaways from all this? Well, first, when things go bad in a financial war, it's the little guy, the small saver, the pensioner, who gets hurt the most. Their savings just evaporate. Second, propaganda is an incredibly powerful tool for turning massive government debt into some kind of patriotic duty. And maybe the most important lesson, the real winners of these crises are often the people in boardrooms and government offices, not the soldiers in the trenches. The insiders always find a way to protect themselves, while the rest of us are told we need to tighten our belts for the good of the country.
So, I'll just leave you with this final thought. That playbook, the one written in the mud and chaos of 1914, is still being used today. It just has fancier names and slicker presentations now. So, knowing what we know, knowing how this story has played out before, when the financial system starts to look shaky and the people in charge get on TV and tell you not to worry, that everything is stable, should you believe them? History suggests that's exactly when you should start asking the toughest questions.